all for joining me for this session on foundations. Delighted to have you here and hope that you'll feel that it's time well spent. I will go no longer than an hour, and I would encourage, if you have a question, go ahead and type that in the Q&A box, and I'll try and kind of watch those as we go. I'm not necessarily a great multitasker, so if I miss any, we will check those questions and make sure that we provide an email response to any questions that we don't get to during the session. Given the amount of content that I hope to share with you today, there may not be a significant portion of time at the end left for a Q&A session, so please just ask questions as you think of them, and as I say, if I don't respond to them, we'll send an email response to all of the questions to everybody. So really a privilege to have you joining me for this session, and let's go ahead and begin with what I hope can be accomplished. I have two major objectives. One is that everyone who is listening has at least a couple of practical ideas that you can take back and implement immediately, but also I hope that you will have a sense of the depth and breadth of the third edition of Foundations, which is just being finished up as we speak, and that you'll have enough information to know whether and how any or all of the modules of the third edition of Foundations might prove to be useful to you. So with that, let me give you just a little bit of background. The third edition of Foundations is just coming out now, and the last portions of that will be available right at the end of the year. I'll make that a little more clear later. And it is the third published edition. The first edition was published in 1992 after 8 or 9 years of field research with hundreds of schools implementing these processes. Then based on what we learned from the first edition, the second edition was published in 2002, and in the intervening 11, 12 years since that time, we've just been adding to the base of what we know about how to help schools and the entire staff of schools work together to achieve some of these kinds of objectives. What's the purpose of Foundations? Well, first and foremost, of course, it is to improve student behavior, and some ways of going about doing that is to increase staff consistency, to enhance student motivation, to excel, and not to just want to avoid misbehaving, but to actually consistently demonstrate one's best, to create an intentionally positive climate. I later in this session will refer to this as the conscious construction of climate, so that all staff is working together to make the school as positive, engaging, exciting, and welcoming an environment as possible. Certainly to engender staff unity, which is a key not only to consistency in responding to misbehavior, but also all of us pulling in the same direction to make this a great and highly motivational school. And that these processes should foster continuous improvement. The good news about this is there's no race to get anything particular done within 1 year. The bad news about this is no matter how fast you go, any school, there's always going to be more that could be improved. And so our hope is that one would never say, oh, we're done with Foundations, because it does need to be a continuous improvement process. That's summed up by a great quote from former Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. The measure of success is not whether you have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it's the same problem you had last year. And the goal of Foundations is that each year you would be able to go, last year these were our 2 major priorities, and those don't need to be our major priorities anymore, not because they were 100% solved, but if we reduce the magnitude of the problem by 80%, now it's a less significant priority so that we can go on to other things that feel more pressing. And in the third edition, we're doing that by providing really extensive materials. But in order for me to get a little bit of a sense of your background coming into this session, now any of you who are listening to the recording won't be able to take part in this, but those of you who are with me live right now, Jackie's going to pull this up as a poll, and if you could, down where it says poll questions over on the right-hand side, if you're a school that is either implementing or has in the past one of the previous editions of Safe and Civil Schools, Randy Sprick's Foundations approach, click A. If you're doing PBIS, some variation of Dr. Sugai's and Horner's approach to things out of the Technical Assistance Center, click B. If you are doing some other school-wide behavior plan, either Highway NOF's Project Achieve or some other specific approach, click C if you would, and maybe in the Q&A, type in what you're doing just so that I can get a sense of the range. And if you're here because you don't currently have a particular approach or model and are just kind of in the beginning stages of looking, click D if you would. So take just a moment and give me that level of feedback, and then we'll be able to post, Jackie will post the results for us. Any of you that haven't yet responded, it's the poll questions down at the bottom of the right-hand side, or at least that's where it is on my screen. If you're doing Foundations, click A, PBIS, Dr. Sugai and Horner's approach, B, some other school-wide approach, C, or no particular approach, D. And Jackie just put the results up for us. And this is great. Some of you didn't answer, and that's just fine, but of those of you who did, we're kind of evenly divided between some previous users of Foundations, some previous or current implementers of PBIS, some other approach, and some people who are just in beginning stages. And that's great. I'll just utilize that information as we go. And it is my hope that regardless of what you answered on that previous question, that some or perhaps all of Foundations might over time be useful to you. So let me give you a little bit of background, a little bit of information about the nature of the product itself. In the third edition of Foundations, based on over 3 decades of doing this work, it is now 6 separate but fully integrated modules labeled as you see here on the screen, modules A through F. And each of those modules tackles a different aspect of school-wide positive behavior support. For each of those modules, there are 8 copies of a book. So this is just showing the 8 copies of Module A. Each of these books is over 200 pages in length and provides detailed guidance about how to proceed with actual implementation. And before the end of our time together, I want to give you a sense of the content of each of the modules. But for each of the modules, the whole idea is that in purchasing either an individual module or the entire set, that you have 8 copies of detailed print guidance in the form of these books, so that each member of your leadership team, your behavior support team, can have the information and can work on the information in advance of, for example, your team meetings or staff presentations. In addition, each book for all 6 of the modules is laid out as presentations or chapters, and we just call them presentations to go along with the video material that I'll share with you in just a minute. And each copy of the book has a CD that has reproducible forms in the format of a fillable PDF. So if, for example, one of the forms that is within Module A that I'll share with you just a little bit later is an agenda for your team-based meetings and a format for taking minutes on those meetings, and if the recorder of your team wanted to, they could just be doing that right on their computer on the fillable PDF. There's also a wealth of examples of school-based or district-based samples of lessons for students, samples of policies, samples of forms, samples of posters that they use to share with kids. In other words, schools and districts have been so generous who have been implementing Foundations over the years that they have given us permission to share as examples for future Foundations implementers the various things things that they have developed. There's also what are called implementation rubrics and checklists to monitor the fidelity of your implementation, and that's another factor that I'll explain a little bit later in this presentation. But continuing this process of just trying to give you a sense of the wealth of what is there in terms of the Foundation's product itself, each of the 6 modules, A through F, has 8 copies of the print material, which is over a 200-page book for each. Each of those books has the CD in it, which also contains PowerPoints of all of the content that's presented both on the DVDs, on the video, but also what is in the text, so that the leadership team actually has pre-made PowerPoints for any of this information that they wish to share with the staff. So it's 6 modules, each of which has 8 copies of the print material, multiple CDs for each of the team members that has PowerPoints, all of the sample forms, etc., and a set of anywhere between 5 and 7 DVDs that has video presentations of the same content. And the content of the material, modules A through F, is this building triangle to create a full continuum of support. Now, I realize that all you can really read on this triangle right now are the modules A through F. So I want to give you a sense of how this content builds through the different modules by walking you through this triangle just a bit. At the very base of the triangle, Module A is all about a continuous improvement cycle, which is the processes for data-driven decision-making, guidance for your team about how to form the team, how to keep the team highly functional, how to create a continuous improvement cycle, and how to actively involve the staff. I'll go into more detail on this content in just a few moments. Moving on to Module B, moving up this triangle, is all about the common areas, arrival, dismissal, cafeteria, playground, but also all about your school-wide policies, dress code, ID badges if you have them, any things that need to be policies that cut across all of the physical areas and contexts of the school. And for those of you who are have previously used Foundations, there is a major and huge addition is it doesn't just tackle common areas, it does tackle things like dress code and how to develop policies and procedures and rituals and lessons, and staff consistency surrounding dress code, because as I frequently say in presentations, a school would be better off with no dress code at all than a dress code that is enforced by only 7 out of 10 of staff. So Module B goes into great detail on how to create that level of unity. Module C moves into creating an inviting climate, that concept that I briefly shared earlier, the conscious construction, all of the staff working together to create an inviting climate. Module D is all about responding to misbehavior so that the entire staff is integrated about when do we use other people relative to disciplinary problems, what things do we handle on our own, how do we correct things in the common area, how do we correct things in the classroom, and how do we create consistency and unity as a staff in how we do respond to the misbehavior that does occur. Module E is about addressing student safety, conflict, and bullying procedures, and working, of course, to reduce and manage conflict and to reduce and follow through on eliminating bullying within our school. And then Module F is all of these aspects of this upper level of the triangle, which is about establishing and sustaining a continuum of behavior support from positive classroom environments through interventions designed to meet the needs even of our most intensive students. So with that said, let's go back to just kind of big picture about how Foundations might be used, and then we'll come back to more detail about the content of the Foundations materials. First of all, Foundations is a continuous improvement cycle. So as I said before, you never are actually done with this process. But in terms of implementing the Foundations material itself, because it's really very extensive, over 2,500 pages of text across these 6 modules, over probably 35 hours of video presentation that corresponds with that text, and hundreds of sample documents from schools, it really isn't something that you just pick up and then implement in a couple of months. The whole idea is that it is guided development over 2 to 5 years. So those of you who indicated that you're just kind of getting started, you haven't implemented any particular approach, you really should look at this as probably a 3 to 5 year process for implementing all of the modules A through F, and probably doing it somewhat in sequence, A, then B, then C, then D. Those of you who have been implementing either foundations or have been implementing PBIS as per the guidance of Dr. Sugai and Horner, you might look at foundations, and as I go through the content of this, there might be particular modules that may be of interest, and it may not be necessary to implement the total foundations approach. Hence, we tried to design it in a menu-driven manner for a school that is in progress, meaning use what you need when you need it. If you need to work on common areas, then Module B may be helpful. If you need to work on consistency of responding to misbehavior in less emotional ways and more consistent ways, you might go right to Module D. If you're working specifically on bullying, you might go right to Module E. And this next slide that I'm going to show you is rather text-driven, but it's more for me just to have my talking points in front. And the powerful thing about this is that this methodology really does work. First of all, before I tell you about the district of 20,000 students, let me mention that Foundations and the other Safe and Civil Schools material are listed on NREP, the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, which is part of the U.S. Department of Education and Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration, their effort to identify evidence-based programs and practices. And we are listed on there for improving academic achievement, reducing out-of-school suspension, increasing consistency of disciplinary practices, reducing bullying-related behaviors like hitting, kicking, etc. And so this is evidence-based. And one particular example, we did have the privilege of working with a district of about 20,000 students that over 2 years implemented foundations and my approach to classroom management called CHAMPS. And at the end of that 2 years, in the next year, they had reduced out-of-school suspension by 86%, and this was for 2 years' worth of implementing this work. And during that same period, while drastically reducing office referrals and out-of-school suspension, teacher satisfaction with their sense of efficacy and unity about responding to misbehavior increased dramatically. In fact, in one building in the district, teachers responded with 100% agreement to the following confidential survey questions. And this, by the way, is the lowest income school in the district in terms of the community that served, and had the highest rates of out-of-school suspension before this work started. 100% of staff agreed at the end of 2 years of this work that the school has a consistent approach to behavior management and discipline. 100% staff agreement that I receive sufficient support when I have to deal with difficult students and or discipline problems, and 100% agreement at the end of 2 years that the school has an adequate system for identifying and helping students who are at risk of falling through the cracks academically and or behaviorally. So this work really can make a dramatic difference. So let me take a few minutes and talk about the content of each of these modules, and that's my intent basically with the rest of my time with you, is to give you a sense of what each of these modules is designed to do. Again, please feel free, if you wish to ask questions during the time, and let's see, I'm just noticing that somebody did ask a question. I selected C on this poll. My school has used bits and pieces of CHAMPS, Foundations, Positive Behavior Support, and it's currently added Capturing Kids' Hearts. Thank you very much for that example, Kim. And just an example of the interrelationship of this work. I've had the wonderful privilege of working with a large urban district across the last 6 years or so that was implementing Capturing Kids' Hearts in their secondary school. And as we started implementing Foundations, totally integrated that work with the Safe and Civil Schools work. And so the effort to integrate those kinds of things are in fact quite easy to do. And with the modular nature of Foundations, that becomes even easier to do that kind of let's go to what we need when we need it. Thank you for that question and comment, Kim. So Module A has 5 presentations, or the print material. This would be equivalent to 5 chapters. And the first of those is just how does this work fit within a multi-tier system of behavior support, and how do you align the work of behavior with the things that you're doing with RTI or tiered systems of support for academics. The second presentation or chapter goes into great detail about team processes, because here's what we know. If the team is not functioning well, if the team does not represent the staff well, if the team is not working actively to do what is specified in Presentation 5, to actively engage and unify the entire staff, that these processes either become busy work or they come to a halt. And what the team is doing is driving a continuous improvement cycle that I'll show you a little bit later, and that cycle is driven by data-driven processes. In other words, utilizing multiple data sources to identify a manageable number of priorities that the leadership team on the behavior side of a tiered systems of support approach to things is driving to, once a priority is set some improved procedures. And also some themes within Module A that run across all of those presentations are to create some common language within the school for how we do problem solving and how we address behavior, to focus to a huge degree on adult responsibility for prevention. And while Foundations puts a great deal of emphasis on the importance of teaching kids to behave responsibly, it also puts a huge level of responsibility onto us, the adults in the school, for making sure that the school is the easiest place possible for our kids to make responsible decisions and to behave in responsible ways. Another goal of Module A is to create a problem-solving mentality amongst all staff. Whenever we're seeing behavior of a school-wide problem, a classroom-based problem, or the problems of an individual student's behavior, the hope is over time that people's first reaction won't be anger or frustration or hostility at the kid or the family or the community. It'll be, what can we do about that? What variables can we manipulate? What puzzle pieces can we put in place to try to help this group or this child behave responsibly? And certainly a theme that runs throughout all of Module A is the critical nature of staff unity, because if everybody does a little, then nobody has to do a lot. Just one example of the common language that is established, and to Kim, where you're implementing CHAMPS, as you said in your question and comment. CHAMPS is my classroom management piece, Foundations, my school-wide piece. You're familiar probably with this acronym, STOIC. We use this as a vehicle for trying to train all staff that certainly students need to be treated with respect, and the variables that we, the staff, implement are structuring all school settings for success. And let me just give you one quick example of a structural example. And then I'll mention the T, the O, the I, and the C of STOIC as well. But just before I go on, noise in an elementary school cafeteria is a frequent problem of many elementary schools. And there is, you'll see the picture here of a school, Wilson Elementary from Fresno, California, of an almost miraculous cure to the problem of excessive noise in a cafeteria. If you can put kids on only one side of the cafeteria tables, that is a structural change change that makes it easier for kids to keep their voices down. When kids are having to talk across tables, you end up with 8 kids talking together, and because they're talking across the tables who are further away need to talk louder, which forces us to talk louder, which forces them to talk louder. And it's just a structural invitation to a problem where this is a structural invitation as the solution to that problem of keep your voice down and only talk to 1 or 2 people who are seated near you. So we want people thinking in terms of structural elements. Now back to this STOIC as an example of common language. Not only do we need to structure settings for success, but the T is we need to teach our behavioral expectations to students like a good basketball coach teaches, which means with clarity, with repetition as necessary, with review as we have to, and with inspiration about who we can be as a team, or in this case, who we are in this school. The O of STOIC is observe and monitor, supervise. The I is, while we're supervising, let's interact positively with students. And the C is correct fluently. And just an example of this becoming the common language of a school, I was doing a 2-day session in launching foundations at our national conference in Portland in the summer, this last summer, and I mentioned STOIC and mentioned the importance of common language. And that evening, somebody sent me this picture and a follow-up picture that I'll show you in just a moment. These are the new the trainers of new teachers and the mentors of new teachers in Duval County Schools, large district in Jacksonville, Florida. And they have been implementing foundations and champs for many years. And all new teachers are trained by these lovely trainers in champs. And this T-shirt that they sent me, keep calm and stoic on, meaning they're training all of the people in the district to think of stoic as a framework for problem solving. But even with their new teachers, they're reminding them that a way to stay calm is to remember you have multiple variables that you can manipulate when there's a problem. So continuing with Module A for just a few more minutes, a huge part of Module A is trying to institutionalize this continuous improvement cycle. And our goal in foundations, people who implement our approach to school-wide discipline or school-wide behavior support, is the institutionalization of this cycle so that even when we're done with any formalized levels of training, this cycle of reviewing meaningful data to select a manageable number of priorities. Once we've prioritized something, we're going to develop revision proposals, which if adopted by staff, we will implement. If not adopted by staff, it will cycle back for more revision. But once adopted by staff, we will implement. And all steps of that cycle are articulated in quite a bit of detail in Module A, because Module A is all about the processes. Those of you who have been implementing foundations in the past, here is another major addition that was not included in either the first or second edition. We talked about the importance of staff engagement in Unity, but we weren't as specific. And within revised foundations, based upon what we've seen from high implementation schools, is we've shared a wealth of sample memos from the team to the entire staff, newsletters from the team to the entire staff to keep this work going, sample presentations from the team to the staff, various activities, and even structure to your meeting. So I'm going to kind of blitz through several slides here that are just examples of the types of documents that are within foundations to help you as a team easily be able to develop things. Like this one is a sample of a staff newsletter from the foundations team to the entire staff about what we're working on, what our current data is showing, upcoming events, and so on. There's a sample, this is also from Duval County, one of the high schools. This is a sample PowerPoint that this great school did to bring their staff back on board at the beginning of a new year. And having samples from other teams makes it easier for you to develop things than to just sit down with a blank piece of paper and go, let's write a newsletter, or let's write a memo, or let's do a PowerPoint. Another example of a memo. And I apologize for the size of this. As Jackie mentioned at the outset, we had a little bit of a technical glitch that we can't get over, but we will send you these documents and things in the form of a PowerPoint. But this is a sample 1-hour Foundations team meeting agenda, and this is what I was mentioning, that this is actually on the CD of Module A as a fillable PDF, so that your recorder for your team could actually be taking notes right on this material. This is another example from Module A, which is, are you an effective team builder? We even have a process built in where we encourage an annual review for all team members to do some self-reflection and goal setting about each individual person doing self-reflection. This is not evaluating each other, but each person doing a self-reflection of what are my strengths as a team member and what are my potential weaknesses. Tom, thank you for the feedback. Trying to multitask here and watch. I'm glad this is a helpful overview. Appreciate that feedback. You give me energy to carry on. The final thing that I'll wrap up about Module A are two really important things that appear in all of the modules. And the first of those is the importance of archiving and demonstrating fidelity of implementation. Here's something that was really sad. In the early years of implementing Foundations, I was doing a lot of work through service centers or educational service districts, CSAs, EXUs, et cetera, and where we had schools from different districts. And we had schools that over 2 or 3 years that made dramatic changes, but then the principal and a key teacher moved away and it all went away. And so one thing that we have done in revised Foundations is we have detailed guidance about how every step that you implement, everything that you develop to address a priority, how to archive that in a way so that you create a cultural history of your school that articulates, you'll just see the bullet points there, everything from our mission statement and staff beliefs to the purpose of our team, jumping down to the middle, our common area policies and procedures, jumping about 2/3 of the way down, our lesson plans for how we teach safety, our lesson plans for how we teach our guidelines for success, jumping closer to the bottom, our policies and procedures, this comes from Module C, for orienting new students to our school, and even our policies and procedures for orienting new staff. Any of these things that your team works on, you need to archive that so you never have to reinvent it, and so that none of it is person-specific, and if somebody moves away, you never want good policies and procedures to be gone just because somebody moved to a different school. And then lastly, this is something that runs through all of the material, is there's something called, for each of the modules, A through F, there's something called an implementation rubric, which basically lays out preparing, getting started, moving along, and in place for each of the presentations that are within that module. And remember, the presentations correspond to chapters in the print material and DVD presentations in the video material and PowerPoints of all of this content as well. So for example, A2 is about your team processes, and it allows you, once you've implemented Module A, to rate yourself basically on our levels of implementation. And with these levels of implementation, it allows you, this is, and again, my apologies for the small print, but this is Module A, Module B, Module C, Module D, in other words, in a one-page document, you can summarize all 6 of these rubrics to identify where you as a school have completed your work. For example, in this school, they've completed most of the things on Module A. They've done some of the things for Module B, some of their common areas, but still have work to do. And some, but not all of Module C is moving along and hopefully eventually will be in place. They've not yet started, though, Module D, nor have they started implementation of Module E. So it basically is a one-page roadmap of where have we been and where are we going. Okay, so with that said, let me move to some brief presentations on the other modules. Module B is about managing behavior in the common areas of the school, and Module B is built completely around structure. One of the presentations is entirely on how do you structure common areas for success. If you have an electronics policy in your school, how do you create a good structure for your electronics policy? I will show you an example of that one in just a moment. Then how do we teach, once we've structured our common areas and our common policies, how do we design lessons to teach kids in age-appropriate ways? And there's sample lessons, there's sample lesson templates for how you go about doing that. There's sample lesson schedules even for high school level, how you could distribute this across the first week of school. And the O, the I, and the C of this STOIC acronym are all about how do we supervise in common areas and how do we supervise for our common area, our common policies as well. So let me give you a few quick examples. This is actually from a school that has implemented foundations for a number of years and is still continuing to do so and to refine their efforts. It's a large high school in Alief, Texas, which is a large district that's been implementing this work for, I believe, almost 13 years now with great success. And Hastings Ninth Grade Center is a large ninth grade center, I believe over 1,000 students. And a number of years ago, they were having trouble and struggles with kids with ID badges. And they just developed a simple set of procedures that when kids don't have their ID badges, there's an easy way to get a temporary badge. But once they've had to ask for X number of temporary badges, then they're automatically issued a new ID, and there's a cost for that. But by just laying out with clarity, how do we monitor this and how do you as students function within this, it took almost all of the friction of this problem of ID badges away. Here's another example. This is a high school example. Elementary people, bear with me for just a moment. This comes from an A&M Consolidated High School, a very large high school in College Station, I believe in College Station, Texas. They had been implementing this work for some time, but something that was a bit of a struggle for them, and totally understandably, was electronic devices, because some teachers wanted them banned from the school altogether, and yet some teachers resisted that because they actually were building their curriculum around kids utilizing the devices. So their leadership team tackled that problem. They came up with this proposal, which their staff adopted. Now every classroom has this large laminated poster in their classroom. Every teacher has a movable clip where every class period they will indicate one of these three policies for today. For example, electronic devices will not be used in class today. Your electronic devices should be silenced and out of sight. So a teacher who never uses devices in the classroom has the clip showing that space and actually says to students, in my room, this is never moving. You never have these devices, but this visual is always up there. On the other hand, a teacher who sometimes uses the devices may some days have this indicated. On another day, they may indicate this. Electronic devices will be used in class today, but they should be silenced and out of sight until I ask you to take them out. Or some days it may be this. Electronic devices will be used in class today. Please have them out when the tardy bell rings. In other words, they took something that was an inconsistency among staff, and they figured out a way to create a win situation for every single staff member. And by creating clarity for kids about what before looked like an inconsistency between trained staff, now we have consistency. It didn't eliminate totally the problem of electronic devices and kids having them out when they shouldn't, but it reduced it to such a degree that this is no longer the major frustration for the staff that it was before. I realize this text is way too small, but this is a supervisor's job expectations for the playground. In other words, it's a job description for playground supervisors. We found that when schools develop a job description for your playground supervisors, it both is an easy way to communicate what a vitally important job that is, but also it makes it easier whenever there's turnover of playground supervision. You don't have to start from a blank piece of paper to try to train them. Likewise, this next document that I just put in here just mainly to be able to share with you the depths of the kinds of things that we tried to include in revised foundations. This is the art of supervising secondary school hallways. In other words, we created a one-page document that is how do you observe actively when you're in the halls, how do you interact positively while you're observing, and how do you correct fluently, meaning briefly, consistently, respectfully, and calmly. And by creating this document, you as a foundations team would have this document, which of course you can easily modify as well to fit your school, but it makes it easier for your foundations team to develop a mini in-service for your staff, to train your staff about how do we, the staff, set the tone in the hallways, how do we create consistency in the hallways, but how do we also just make sure that we are all observing actively and supporting each other. And so those of you that have used foundations before, it's just much richer in these exemplars of possible policies and procedures. Then this again is just showing for Module B, the rubric, and I realize this is too small, so I'm going to go right to this one. This rubric, which here has hallways, restrooms, playground, etc. This rubric I've just taken in place, meaning this column here, and for any common area, this rubric says that you will only mark it in place if you've done preparing, getting started, moving along, but in place means common area supervisory procedures are communicated to and monitored for implementation with all of our supervisors. And if you've done this, this is true both for a self-evaluation for your team, but also those of you where you are district-wide committed to this work, it is a way to have a district team look at and monitor, have schools really done this work or haven't they? If we've done this work, we should have evidence of it in the form of policies, procedures, and lessons that are documented in the Foundations archive, meaning we're creating the cultural history, and as appropriate in the staff handbook. Meaning, if we've really done this work, let's make sure that we've archived it in ways that it will never have to be reinvented from a blank piece of paper. That gives you a little bit of a sense of Module B. There's the similar kind of work for common policies. This is the rubric for policies. This would be dress code, ID badges, electronics policies, anything like that. School-wide policies, lessons, and procedures have been written and are reviewed as needed with staff, students, and parents. And the evidence would be that those policies, lessons, and procedures are documented in both the Foundations archive and as appropriate in the staff handbook. Okay, let me go on to Module C. Module C is all about the conscious construction of an inviting school climate, meaning the school climate really is not the physical building, it's not the amount of natural light, it's not the color of the paint that you have on the walls, it is the collective behavior of the staff. And one of the things that we're really trying to educate everybody about with this whole module devoted to the conscious construction of a positive climate is giving ammunition to the team to be able to share with the staff for how we can grab a hold of this and make this school the most exciting, inviting school in the world. And let me get at this with some powerful information that is taken, that's within Module C, but it is taken directly with full credit for the brilliance of this from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC states directly on their website, school connectedness is an important factor in both health and learning. Students who feel connected to school are more likely to attend school regularly, stay in school longer, and have higher grades and test scores. In other words, this is the kind of thing that we want to give the team ammunition to share with the staff. School life is so important for kids, and school climate is vital because, moving to the second bulleted point, students who feel connected to school are less likely to smoke, drink, or have sexual intercourse at an early age. They're less likely to carry weapons, become involved in violence, or be injured from dangerous activities such as drinking and driving or not wearing seatbelts. In other words, our level of helping create school connectedness has an impact even on kids drinking and driving or not wearing seatbelts. Lastly, they're less likely to have emotional problems, suffer from eating disorders, or experience suicidal thoughts or attempts. In other words, our work on school connectedness is quite literally not just let's make this school a happy place like Disney tries to do. It's let's make this such a positive school that kids are so connected to who we are and what we do that they're going to make good health choices. And we owe a debt of gratitude to the Center for Disease Control for having looked at and summarized all of this research. They also went on, still direct quotes from the CDC. 4 factors can help strengthen school connectedness for students: adult support, belonging to a positive peer group, commitment to education, and a positive school environment. School staff members are important adults in students' lives. The time, interest, attention, and emotional support they give students can engage them in school and learning. So those are examples are all from the CDC, but they're in the introduction to Module C. Also in the introduction to Module C are a number of examples. I've just chosen one given time limitations, and I am watching the time, so I'll be moving on to the other modules here fairly quickly. But this is an example in Module C that a middle school principal shared with one of my trainers in doing a presentation on the importance of climate. He said he selected from his, I believe, approximately 500-student school, 50 students, and remember, randomly selected, and asked those students to respond to this question: what 3 things would you like your teachers to know about you? And students, these 50 students, he had them write their responses. He was actually somewhat shocked that almost all of the students responded with very serious issues. He sort of thought, oh, they're going to say, oh, I'm on the soccer team, oh, my birthday's on February 21st, or whatever. They didn't. They shared concerns about divorce, separations, physical moves, medical concerns within their family. And he said almost all 50 shared some really very, very personal information about these are things that they would like teachers to know. He only selected kids who had been in the school for at least a few months. He then did this. He typed up the 50 sets of responses. This is student 1, this is student 2, this is student 3, but without their names. He put the pictures and names in one column. He put the 50 sets of what would I want my teachers to know about me in another column, and he asked the teachers to match them up. He asked the staff to do this little matching exercise. I want you to reflect on how many do you think each staff member identified correctly? Just come up with your own mental guess. If we had more time, I would actually have you type it in chat, but in the interest of buying myself some time, I'm just going to go right on and tell you. Most got only 1 to 3 correct. One person did get 4, and one staff member matched 47 of the 50 names. And here's the next little question to reflect on. Who was that? Was it who got 47? And remember, most of us got only 1 to 3. One of us got 4. One person got 47 out of 50. Was it an 8th grade teacher? Was it the counselor? Was it assistant principal? Was it the ISS aide? Was it a school social worker? Was the cafeteria manager? I actually, when I saw this, my first guess was, if it's a really great social worker, it's probably the social worker. I was dead wrong. It was the in-school suspension aide. And in talking about this with my wonderful colleague and friend, Bob McLaughlin, who's Foundation's trainer, the principal went on to say, it is not that these 50 kids had been in school suspension. Remember, these kids were randomly selected. It's that this person took the time every day, every passing period, to be out in the halls making an effort to greet students, talk to students, etc. And by the 3rd time she's introduced herself to a student and that student was comfortable with her, that student started talking to her. It's just a fabulous example of, if you pair that with the CDC information, we as school personnel make a huge difference. You pair that with what this brilliant principal did, finding out from kids, what should teachers know about you? And it's some of this serious stuff, and yet most of us could only identify 1, 2, or 3 in this matching exercise. But the one person who makes a conscious effort to be invitational knew a lot. Now, Module C is basically oriented like this. There's the introductory material about how important school connectedness is to try to sell the staff on that concept. Presentation 2 is about guidelines for success, the broad overarching goals of the school. And this is very similar, those of you who have previously implemented Foundations, to old Foundations. There's more samples, there's more documents, there's a little bit more guidance about how, but it's very similar to what was in Foundations, 1st edition and 2nd edition. We did add a whole presentation that is just to work with the staff on the importance of ratios of interactions, and any of you are not familiar with that concept. In most schools, we pay more attention to misbehavior. Get back in your seat, keep your hands to yourself, now's not the time to be talking about that, you should not use that kind of language, than we do to paying attention to students when they're not misbehaving. Good morning, it's nice to see you today, and specific, descriptive, positive feedback. So this is a whole presentation geared to the team to potentially share with the staff, if they wish to, about why ratios are important, and I'll show you some sample documents that we use to try to help increase people's ability to be positive. There's a whole presentation on improving attendance, because chronic absenteeism is a huge problem in our schools, and there's a whole presentation when you're targeting that particular issue on both analyzing the data, analyzing your policies, as well as intervening in universal ways and moving into targeted interventions for students who need it. Presentations 5 and 6 are all about meeting students' basic needs, and although it's richer than it was in old Foundations, it is very much like it was in old Foundations for just ensuring, that this school should be a great place for all kids, even the most average kids. No student should fade into the woodwork. And something that's entirely new is the vital importance of systematically welcoming new students, not just at the beginning of the year like 6th graders in a middle school, but kids who move in during the year, and developing policies and procedures and rituals that make it easy for us to do conscious welcoming, but also even how are we welcoming new staff and bringing them on board with any policies, procedures, and rituals that we have developed. So I'll just show you just a couple of quick examples of some of the types of things that are in revised Foundations. One is there's sample lessons on guidelines for success. Another is, this is an example from one of the Fresno schools that we've had the privilege of working with. This is November December, January, across this way, they introduced the concept of ratios of interaction. So this first box says 3 positives to 1 corrective a day, and that continues across each of these boxes. But then each month they just layered in a 5 to 10 minute in-service with their staff. Now, while we are keeping 3 positive to every corrective going, now provide 3 periods at your door to greet kids each day, and then 3 positive parent contacts a week, and so on. And by layering a new one in each month, it was just this brilliant concept of, if we just add in a little bit more conscious invitationalness, if each of us does a little, then none of us have to do a lot. Now, I'm going to skip over a few things in the interest of time here and move on to Module D. And Module D is about responding to misbehavior and instructional approach. And within Module D, there's 5 presentations. And the first of those presentations is just for your team to have, again, ammunition to share with the staff about the important interrelationships between proactive procedures, corrective procedures, and individual student behavior management plans. And then presentations 2 through 5 go into how do we define behavior in ways that will reduce the problem that in some schools, some teachers refer kids who don't have their pencil to the office, and other teachers, of course, only refer extremely severe misbehavior. How can we empower all staff with corrective consequences for responding to most misbehavior in the setting in which it happens, but that we ensure that when we really need it, we do get administrative support for those most severe misbehaviors, and perhaps most importantly in new foundations that didn't exist in old foundations, is a whole presentation, chapter, DVD, on preventing the misbehavior that leads to referrals and suspensions. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip down to some things. One thing that is in Module D is a set of lessons for teaching kids about how to interact with adults. And while there's a whole lot more in Presentation 5 of Module D, one very important task is this concept of lessons that you can look at, adapt, modify, select the ones that you want. But these 9 lessons are a way of teaching students how to interact with adults. For example, accepting a correction. My hypothesis is that many times kids land in the office for insubordination because they argue about being stopped for running in the halls. This teaches them, how do you work like a good basketball player, and how do you respond to the ref's calls? With only 4 minutes left, let me do just a real quick overview of Module E and Module F. Module E is about improving safety, climate, and discipline. And this little visual, safety, conflict resolution, and bullying prevention, all of them have sample policies, sample procedures, and sample lessons. There's actually within Module E, I believe it's 25 lessons, 7 on safety, 7 on conflict resolution, and 11 on bullying prevention and intervention. And if you already have, for example, a bullying prevention curriculum, you may not use this section of the menu of Module E, but if you have bullying prevention but you don't have conflict resolution, you could take this conflict resolution section and work on that to enhance your current bullying efforts. And then moving on to Module F and then a conclusion. Module F is, let's pull this all together as a continuum, and the title is, or the subtitle is, establishing and sustaining a continuum of behavior support. And so in terms of this triangle that I shared with you earlier, this is everything from positive classroom management all the way up through intensive intervention, and trying to ensure that we do this, that we match the level of intensity of support to the level of student need. And so in this little visual, most students, and most of our students are going to be like student A, they can be supported and be entirely successful with positive classroom management and consistency of school-wide. All of this lower triangle is the lower part of the triangle is school-wide. But some kids, student B here for example, need early stage interventions and they need classroom management that is supported and consistent with administrative walkthroughs and ongoing coaching. Student like student C may need targeted interventions and collaborative problem solving, and a student like student D needs intensive intervention. And Module F is all about creating that consistency of a full continuum of support. And so in wrapping this up, Foundations consists of modules A through F. Those of you who are new to this, try not to be overwhelmed by this. You're going to layer this work in over 2 to 4 years of implementation. Those of you who have been doing this work for some time, if you would choose to get the whole Foundations program, you might work on, for example, Module C, the attendance work. In Module D, you might work on just the lessons for teaching kids how to interact with adults. In Module E, you might just do the conflict resolution work. So with all of that said, let me head to a conclusion. First of all, I invite you to send us questions about any of this. If you just go to either Safe and Civil Schools or Pacific Northwest Publishing, you can send us any questions. We will send out a modified version of this PowerPoint to each of you. But just in wrapping this up, I'm sure since this has been an overview of this material, that if you're considering purchasing, you need to know about the detailed information. Modules A through D are going to be available for shipping early in November. We're wrapping up just the final details of getting all of that in the warehouse. Modules E and F are still in final editorial processes, and the video editing is rather massive because each of the presentations has 6 to 8 hours of video content. So those will be available for shipping in January. Each module is $400. The complete set of A through F is $14.95. And also, if you're ever interested in optional training support on either specific components or ongoing training for leadership teams, contact us at Safe and Civil Schools. So I want to thank you so very much for your time and interest in this, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap up my presentation, but I am going to, and Elizabeth just added, thank you so much, Elizabeth, just added her email address. Elizabeth is our Director of Professional Support, Professional Development, Elizabeth Winford at Safe and Civil Schools, and email any of us if you have a question. I'm going to wrap up because I said I'd stick to the hour, and according to my clock, I'm 1 minute over. But I'll also stay on the line just a little bit if any of you want to write a question. Elizabeth, Jackie, and I will be on until we see that there's no other questions. So thank you so much again for joining us for this session.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Randy, we also very much appreciate you taking your time to give a rundown on the new Foundations materials. As Randy mentioned, we'll stick around for a few minutes and see if any other questions come up. We will send answers to any questions out, along with the link to view the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides in the next couple days.
Let's see, Kim, did you have a question? All I got was the word Randy. There we go. Now I see your question, Kim. What would be the best area to use with new teachers to my school, with some of them coming from elementary to middle? Kim, that's a great question, and it probably depends how far along you are. I remember your statement earlier that you've been doing PBIS, some of Foundations, some of CHAMPS. My first thought on this, but it really does depend kind of on where you are, but I think a good starting place for you, where probably you've got your common areas largely fairly far along, probably your common policies, probably your processes of data-driven decision-making, team functioning, et cetera. I wonder if Module C might be the most logical starting place, because not only does it have one whole presentation on what are we doing with people new to our building and just providing thoughts on how we orient and train staff, but it has that piece on guidelines for success, about how to keep that alive. It has the section on addressing absenteeism. It has that great presentation on the ratios of interactions piece and the importance of being positive. So I think Module C might be a logical starting place. If, on the other hand, you're feeling like almost all of your universal stuff is in place, that getting your people on board, and even coming from elementary to middle, that adjustment is going okay, it might even be Module F that is the moving into the more Tier 2 and integrating with Tier 3 processes. So, I think that probably would be the most logical starting places, would be C or F. You're most welcome, Kim. Any other questions? If you think of any other questions at a later date, please feel free to send them our way. And if it's a question directly for me, my staff always gets those to me immediately. So again, thanks to each of you for taking the time, and I very much appreciate your interest.
Thanks again, everyone, for participating today.
Oh, and Kim, I see you're looking at the old Foundations modules. Really, in the old Foundations modules, really, I would think probably Module 3 is probably your best bet, assuming that you've got the basics in place of your common areas and so on. But if there is a budget for getting revised Foundations, and of course this is self-serving, but if there is a budget, the new Foundations material is so much more extensive, and probably comparing old Foundations to new Foundations, there's probably at least 30 to 40% brand new content for your team to take on across time.
Randy, we have a question which is under the chat box, which you
okay.
may see there.
Actually, I don't. Jackie, can you?
Okay. It says, Dr. Sprick, you presented in Marquette, Michigan a few years back. Our district, the Gogabic, Ontonagon, I'm sure I just butchered that, ISD is comprised of 6 local districts. Can we purchase one set for our ISD, or do they need to be for individual schools?
Great question. The intent is that it be for individual schools. Now, if your ISD is utilizing it and checking it out to schools, that's just fine, but you wouldn't be able to buy one set and reproduce things for all of the schools. You would have to do it kind of in a linear fashion, whereas a school was using the kit, and after they had worked on some of their priorities, somebody else could check out the kit, and so on. So if there is a budget for it to be each of the participating schools having a kit, that would certainly be best. The way the copyright works is it can only be reproduced for the one school that is using it at that point in time. Thank you so much for the ethics around that question. That's very gracious of you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Again, thanks to those of you who hung in here, even to the bitter end, well past the hour. I thank you so much for your time and interest. And again, please feel free to be in touch. Appreciate it. Thank you.